As the first speaker, I proudly support the motion that this House supports the falsification of history in order to create and strengthen national identities. Okay, so first of all, the model. Right, now, we'd be doing this falsification of history primarily through myths and different narratives in general to primarily unify the country. This would happen mostly in schools, we think specifically in sort of younger ages. I would also like to point out that this isn't a radically new idea, right? Every single nation state in the world does this and has done this at one point or another to create this national identity. The country we're from in Mexico, there are plenty and plenty of different myths in national independence and so forth. Now, also, this brings up another point. The particular moments that are usually that would be the most falsified, really, are moments of independence, liberation, ones that already sort of carry the foundation of the state. So it's mostly these foundation myths that we're really talking that would, really need to be falsified anyway. Also, the type of country in which this would happen, right? We feel that countries that already have a strong national identity sort of fall outside of the scope of this debate. We really want to talk about countries that don't have a strong national identity, right? Say countries like many different countries in the Middle East, particularly maybe countries that have been affected by colonialism and therefore need to build national identities in order to have a functioning country. And here is where we move directly into our first point, which is necessity, right? Why would we want to do this? What are the particular benefits and, well, existential necessity of having a generally unified country? So, firstly, this is how it's been done to create nation states pretty much everywhere. But the point of a nation state is being able to have a national project as a group of people, right? To be able to build a nation, physically build one. And the countries places that have not already built a nation physically, literally have to do this task, right? Like there's literal physical building of so fundamentally important. Because without it, you cannot have necessary trade, you cannot have the necessary national involvement to move forward, create, and develop as a whole. We think it also fosters good and better governance in general, right? Like you don't have different regional governments bickering nearly as much if you have national unity. We also think it is able to sort of smooth over things like racism and ethnic tensions, right? If you have one strong national identity, then you're not really going to go and kill or attack or steal from one of your national, from someone who's effectively sort of from the same tribe as you. It's creating a larger nation as a whole, and we think it's particularly good at smoothing out ethnic conflicts. Yes, sir?
Do you agree that creating national identity engenders suppressing all other identities, like religious or ethnic identities?
Well, not necessarily. We believe that you can have a strong national identity, but also have a multicultural state, right? This is something that we see all across the world. Like, every different regions have different regional identities. A strong general national identity cannot function. People be governed by people who they do not identify with, and hence it all sort of breaks down. You're unable to have a good national dialogue. But we do believe in the possibility of a multicultural state. However, that national identity needs to exist in order to be able to have proper multiculturalism and not just completely segmented, pretty much semi-autonomous regions. Like say, in Iraq, there is no strong national Iraqi identity. However, there are different regional identities that do exist. We do believe that they can coexist, but that's why you need a strong national identity to unite everyone, even though they may have differences. No, thank you. Furthermore, we believe that history can be unreasonably divisive, right? Like, the things that happened 100 years ago don't really matter now in the sense that, the people that committed whatever crime or that specific squabble or problem are dead, right? And then literally their children and grandchildren are also no longer really existent. So therefore, whatever tribal squabble might have happened 100 years ago doesn't really matter anymore, and it just has devolved into general feuding, which we think this is particularly good at combating, right? Like, you get rid of these unnecessarily divisive moments in your national history that are genuinely no longer relevant today and need not be relevant, but their memory simply brings up constant conflict and divisiveness. Yes, sir?
So, you say that your history from 100 years ago does not matter. However, in America, black people have been enslaved segregated, not allowed to vote, and that still affects them today. And that still ensures that they are oppressed and they are not as privileged as others. So why do you differ on this?
Well, first of all, let's take the example of the United States. I think if you ask any American, black or white, what their nationality is, they would outright tell you that they're American. The United States has one of the strongest national identities ever. But the point is, like, for example, the Founding Fathers, right? Like, the Founding Fathers, probably a lot of them were racists. However, that's not a particularly important fact necessarily to throw around. Why? Because their principles sort of go beyond that. The principles that founded the country go beyond that, and nonetheless, we believe that not particularly important. Furthermore, the unifying myth of the United States comes in the Civil War with the liberation of thousands of people. So that example, I guess, would fall on our side in any case. Furthermore, there's a second point about childhood development. This is something that's primarily done in schools. As I've already mentioned, this is something every single nation state already does and has already done, right? Like in the this is something that every nation state does and has already done. Therefore, it doesn't really mean that you're not going to be able to find out what really did happen, right? Like, most people do know what happened, but it's, in a way, but you begin to find this out sort of later on in your scholastic career or university career, and this is something that you learn later in your life. We believe that this nation building can have a very particular impact on childhood development. Why? Because children are not born with innate prejudice, right? There's a specific moment when all of these prejudices, all of these cultural influences are poured into children, particularly, say, like primary school and those that specific moment in childhood development. Hence, it's in those moments when you implant these myths. Later on, yes, they will realize that there was no Indian who carried a giant rock and, saved the independence movement in Mexico. However, in that specific moment in childhood development, it serves to create a national identity, and most of all, to erode other prejudice that did pre-exist. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank the previous speaker and call upon the leader of the opposition to open the opposition.
Okay, dear ladies and gentlemen, so the previous speaker told us that, well, all states do it and it brings us enormous benefits, that's why we should continue falsifying history and continue doing so. What we believe in the opening opposition today is that the fact that maybe states do it, it doesn't principally justify that they do so, and moreover we are going to argue that it leads to some bad consequences that would not have happened if the states wouldn't do it. Just one point of rebuttal that is not going to be integrated into my constructive. First of all, the thing that they said that, well, history can be divisive, and now the events that happened many centuries ago and many years ago might not matter. Well, we believe that actually history tends to repeat itself. Sometimes the events that happened even many centuries ago, still the lessons that you can draw from these events, from those wars and stuff, still might be helpful and might be useful, even when you adopt some policies and you in today. So first of all, what I'm going to talk to you about is what are the countries that try to strengthen and create this national identity, and then I'm going to talk about you why bending and falsifying history is bad, and then I'm going to talk about to you why the imposition of national identity over some other identity is principally wrong and we should not do it. So, what are the countries that try to do it, that try to create and strengthen national identities? Yes, these are the countries that do not have a strong national identity one, but what particularly are those countries? We believe that two groups of countries. First of all, these are the countries that have done something wrong in the past. For example, we could consider the example of Germany in right after the Second World War, or it is some new countries which just got their independence, which do not have a long record of being independent and of having their national sovereignty. So first of all, let's talk about these countries that have done something wrong in the past. As I have already told you, it's very important that countries do not falsify history because it leads to some very grave consequences. Why is that? Because history it tends to repeat itself, and it's very useful that actually countries learn from history, and that they understand the mistakes that they have done in the past, and that the governments, when they create some policies, that they take into account what their previous governments, what the previous societies of their countries have done, so that they can be guided by these particular principles. Moreover, it is very important that the population will not be misled, because if it is a democratic state, then the population votes into power exactly the government that they want to rule. So it's very important that the population itself understands, for example, what this country has done in the past, and it's very important that this population votes for the right, for the government that would not commit the same mistakes. So the example here would be actually Germany, which is an example of what should happen. It's because it's admitted all its wrongdoing in the past. Now it's considered to be an exemplar state of how it is never going to commit its mistake. If it hadn't do it, if it created the identity of building on the some revenge or stuff, that would have led to some bad consequences. But then no. Some principal argumentation, why it's bad that you impose national identity on the population. So, for example, if it's now we're going to talk about the second group of countries. These are the emerging new countries. I think Macedonia would probably be a good example because it got its independence only after the collapse of Yugoslavia. So, it means that if there is an all strong national idea, it means that people already have some other kind of identity. It's probably either their ethnic identity or their religious identity. And in response to my POI, the opening government tells that these two identities can easily coexist. We believe that if you, as a government, are trying to falsify the history and you are trying to impose this identity on these particular individuals, that the possibility that these identities are going to peacefully coexist is very, very unlikely. Because it means that when you falsify history, you are trying to diminish the importance of particular ethnicities or in the history, or you try not to underline the importance of some religious groups in the society. And what you are trying to say now is that you're saying that what matters is only the nation, the statehood of this country, of this country. So, for example, if we take say Yugoslavia, so what they try to do is that they try to impose some national identity on the population, saying that you all are Yugoslav, that you all you are not Serbs, Croats, or Macedonians, and you are not Orthodox Catholics or Muslims, that you all are Yugoslav. So what it led to is that people were suppressed, people could not open people felt that their true identity was somehow diminished, that they lived in a state which did not recognize them, which did not value them for who they really are, and that eventually led to the fact that they were so dissatisfied with the country that it led to the war and simply to the collapse of this country. So what we would suggest is that simply all identities would be taken into account, and with using the narrative of history without falsifying it, just coming to terms, reconciling, and bringing all ethnicities and all religions together. Before that's opening, yeah.
You realize though that a lot of these countries who don't have a strong national identity end up even descending into civil war and having tons of different ethnic strife, right?
We believe that what you are trying to propose to us eventually will lead to civil war again. What we are trying to propose to you is that you use the narrative of the true history, is that you are trying to acknowledge the wrongdoings of all the ethnicities, of all the minorities that have done, and that you are trying to reconcile them, and that's how you build actually the national identity, and not by falsifying the history. Because there will always be individuals and groups and organizations that will know that this history was falsified, and they will try to radicalize and will to tell people that this is not true, and that the state is just trying to impose something on you. So, the last point is actually why imposing this identity is also very systematically problematic. Because this identity is always imposed by a certain government which is in power. And what it means is that the government is also, say, for example, either liberal or conservatives. It means that the identity it is trying to impose, it engenders some particular values which are like either say conservative or liberal. Again, what we see now in Macedonia, like the conservative government is in power and it is trying to create this national identity of like conservative Macedonian society, which of course is not true of all the population in the society. So we think it's also problematic. For all these reasons, very proud to oppose. Thank you.
Like I think the previous speaker to call upon that the Ukrainians should continue the government side.
Is everyone ready?
Okay. We must all be citizens first, because that is the first thing that is distinguishing when we are given rights, when we are given and treated equally, and that is fundamental in the way in which social relationships function today. That is why I stand strongly on the side of the government. I'll go through a point-by-point refutation of the main three arguments that have been sort of presented by the previous speaker, and then talk about social relationships today. So let's talk firstly about why history repeats itself and the inevitability of this whole thing. Now, this was mentioned briefly, but the thing is that when we build our narratives of existence and our trajectory as a human species around these particularly divisive moments, then we are very likely to repeat them again. In fact, like the dialectical relationship between these two events and the way in which history is brought upon us and given to us and the way it's going to repeat itself in the future is fundamental, and we think that it must be changed in order for us to truly change things that we don't want to be repeated again. We must change the narrative. So let's go on to the two main points of different distinctions. No, thank you. So first of all, in the first argument, they mentioned Germany and the Nazis. So I mean, I'm gonna touch these briefly, but nonetheless, we'd like to just mostly focus on emerging nations. Now, first of all, Germany has a strong national identity today. Most Germans will tell you they are German, so mostly they fall out of this debate. Secondly, a lot of that national identity is reliant on properly recording what happened in these horrible things, in their horrible history. Like, we're not saying that because because you falsify history doesn't mean that you're going to just blanketly erase all of it. If it's fundamental to building your national identity, as it is in Germany, then you wouldn't delete it. So then all of the examples on Germany fall flat. Now, no, thank you. So furthermore, let's talk mostly about countries that have borders drawn on them by colonial powers and all of these things which have particularly distinct difficulties when building a nation. We think that this debate relies mostly around them. What we're talking about is that when they tell us about the different the Yugoslavian Republic, right, and all of these different different identities that people do, we think that nationality is able to triumph over all of them. To say, I am Mexican first, and then I am Catholic, atheist, and then I belong to a different part of region of my country. I am Mexican first, and I recognize my fellow Mexican, and I am subject to the same laws, and only then can there be justice in my country. Because even though there may be identities that exist before, these identities are eroded slowly. Because, for example, in Mexico, when in the there might be different pre-Hispanic cultures and empires within our country, but those identities have been slowly eroded away. But nonetheless, we still have local cuisines, we still have different different dialects that happen, or different variations in language. But nonetheless, before all of that, we are united under one single national identity, and that is fundamental in the creation of a nation state that respects and creates justice for all of its citizens, everyone included, no exceptions. No, thank you. So that is what I'm going to tell you about our third argument, that is about social relationships today. Now, Backup position tells us slightly about the way that privileged groups are able to draw from their historicity because they're and create something called privilege, for example, in the United States when it comes to white and black relations. Now, we think that this is particularly why we should be able to change the narrative around these things, because we want to look past that. We want to end racial tensions. We want to end these ethnic tensions. We want to go beyond that. That we are a citizen before we are bearers of racial and ethnic features, and that is fundamental to the creation of a society in which everyone is treated equally, no exceptions. That is the point. That privilege privileged groups draw from their historicity, that they are able to say that since they were oppressors once, they will continue to be oppressors, and we would like to change that narrative. We don't want people to form their identity around those particularly divisive moments in history that are no longer of any use to here today. None of that content is engaged on the other bench. Now, secondly, we tell you there's a second line of analysis about this is about drawing international relations. A lot of resentment is done from the things that people have done in the past. Arguably bad things, but we don't want those bad things to continue to characterizing all of our trajectory. We would like to look beyond them, to go past them. Certainly, 1800 Europe was a terrible place if you were was someplace you resented if you were living in under colonial rule. But certainly, just because they did that doesn't mean that they shouldn't be able to collaborate with them. They shouldn't go beyond looking with them, especially if they're able to analyze the situation today and reasonably say that they are and both of their interests align, regardless of their historicity. What we care about is today and the creation of a just system. Back.
Yeah, in a lot of instances, states falsify their past to over-glorify what they've done before to strengthen their national identity. Do you stand for those instances too?
I mean, come on. I mean, not as a blanket place. Certainly, we think that, for example, when a gigantic Indian man in Mexico is able to carry on the revolutionaries' dream forward and give us a country, then certainly, there is glory for these people. There is inclusion in the differences in the myths that may not necessarily be real, but nonetheless are able to recognize that everyone was a part of our national independence. And that is why, we've told you about the necessity of these particular moments, particularly when it comes to revolutions, when it comes to moments of independence. And that is so important, because these myths, even though they might not be real, allow us to create a foundation in which everyone is included and everyone was a part of a movement that aspired to be bigger than themselves. And those are the principles on which these countries must be founded, on justice, on inclusion, and bringing everyone together. That is fundamental to identify with and create these myths so that we are able to create a narrative that encompasses everyone, regardless of where they were coming from. They were all bound together by a single dream. And that is why history is unnecessarily divisive. And particularly when the whole argument about childhood development and that specific moment when children develop their prejudices is not engaged by all in the opposition. We tell you that children are often indoctrinated into having divisive beliefs a lot of times because of the narrative that we give them regarding their history. That is why we stand strongly as citizens first and everything else after.
I'd like to thank the previous speaker and call upon the deputy leader of the opposition.
Falsification of history is lying to your own people about their past in order to create some national identity which their government have chosen. We believe that it is unfair, and we believe that it also defines a type of identity which has arbitrarily chosen and the people probably have never chosen to identify with. That's what I'm going to talk about in my speech. First of all, let's talk about why this imposition of historical identity through falsification of history is unfair. Because falsification of history is not just interpreting history, which a lot of countries do. For example, you can portray your nation more favorably in history books. Falsification of history is exactly lying and giving wrong facts about the past of your nation. For example, how your nation was created, saying that, for example, that Ukrainian nation was created from some very old tribes in the ancient times, which is exactly not good and not proven by history. But you create the school books which say this to create your national identity, to show how long the history of the nation is. First of all, we believe that individuals should be entitled to choose their own identity and to choose to make just in general entitled to a free choice. But this free choice is undermined when they are not given enough information to make this choice, when they are lied by their governments, when they are lied and indoctrinated on an everyday basis about their historical past. Even if they choose to be, for example, like a nationalist, to be like, even if they choose in this case this national identity, the choice is invalid because they have not been given enough information to make this free choice. We believe that this is like intrinsically bad to their citizens, to your people, because the government has no like entitlement or right to impose identities. It's just a group of people elected by people to present their interests. Why suddenly they got a right to impose some ideas on people? Secondly, as my partner have shown you, some identities may be more important for you than national identities. Like, for example, religious identity may be more important for you. But through falsification of history, what are you exactly doing? You like lying to me in order for me to deny my religious identity and accept some other identity, which is also like principally wrong. Then also, they have a very radical case. They say like national state is one of the best state, like is one of the best forms of organization. We do not think so because we saw like a lot of states which are not national, which are united not by like some kind of national ideas, but just by the fact that people live together, like for example in communities, they cooperate, they try to make the area where they live better because of, for example, to improve infrastructure, to invest in projects in these regions. But we also saw like a lot of like very radical national states which for which like nationalism is very important. For example, like let's take the example of Hungary, which is not ready to accept refugees because they have this very strong nationalism which says like we are Hungarians, we are one nation. All other nations like are a little bit different. That is why we have much less responsibility towards them. That is why we have no responsibility towards refugees, etc. That means that national identity is not good by itself. We need to prove this, but we saw that you can unite your nation without like creating this like very strong national identity. Also, what we say, if you are talking about like societies which just create their national identities, very often these are post-conflict societies. It means that if you try to like falsify history in those, first of all, we believe that a lot of people who participated in the conflict, for example, in the civil war which has happened, are still alive. It means that it's very like saying them like some falsified facts will be. They may be very vulnerable to this like false interpretations because they know the past, they know what exactly happened. But if you try to impose this false identity on them, they will like clearly show it will not create like kind of reconciliation in these post-conflict societies. It's much better to accept your previous mistakes, to accept the mistakes you have made in the past, to show why it happened, what exactly has happened, because most people will be more ready to agree with it, and if they agree with your facts, then they will be also more ready to agree with your like interpretation of those facts and your, for example, vision of the future, how you see this future. We believe that like it may be, for example, the case like of post-conflict Bosnia and Herzegovina. You cannot say that, for example, like Albanians and Croats like had lived for like several for dozens of years without any war, like for example without any conflict. This will be exact falsification of history. This might help you to form a national identity. But if like most people just came out of this civil war or like of this conflict and they know what exactly happened, it will be very difficult for you to build the foundations of the nation on this like wrong premises which most people know that are not true. First.
Right. All religions and cultures have formed their identity based on foundation myths and other historical lies. Does this then mean that all religions and pretty much all other types of cultural identities are therefore de facto bad? And if so, what's left?
No, it doesn't mean this, because religions like are formed through history, through historical development. But like national states, they are not based on some, like they are not supposed to be based on some myths. Your nation is supposed to be based on the fact that you live together on a certain territory. You not necessarily should be united by, like for example, a common history. The fact, the major like characteristic of a nation is that this is a territory where people live. You can unite them on the idea of, like for example, making this land better. And even if like the religion is created on the myth, like we do not think that it's probably a good example to lie to the people about your past. Then we also believe that the way this classification are often done very arbitrarily, and it means that whenever you got like, first of all, if this like post-conflict society or just society in a new country, like it means that the government came to power according to some probably like power sharing agreement, but it never had a right to like rewrite their history to unite this nation. It, like, for example, if you take again like the example of Ukraine, where like school books are were rewritten every like 4 years after like a new president came to power. For example, when a pro-European president comes to power, he writes certain school books and then starts to indoctrinate their own people into the fact that like Ukraine is much closer to Europe, like Ukrainians are like a great nation. Then a new president comes to power which says like, no, Ukrainians was like a part of Russia, they are very close to Russia, etc. It just shows you how arbitrary a criterion of rewriting the history. People have never like chosen to be like identified by this criteria, and it's very bad that this classification of history is very vulnerable to interpretation of just certain group of politicians who sometimes even like have not been chosen by democratic vote but just in a post-conflict society. So I'm very proud to oppose. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the previous speaker and call upon the member of the government to open the second half of the
I am very sure of in the both paradigm, the ethnocentrist or separatist or radical ethnicity group to agitate the uniqueness, differences, and to separate nation is existing, Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen. In both paradigms, the real question in this debate is how to counter to these kind of separatists and how to unite a system based on the state narrative, Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen. Recognizing this context, we are happy to tell a lie, Mr. Speaker, because as long as the majority citizens, this kind of establishers of the new nation, are satisfied and believing in the state preferable narrative and satisfied with the unification to which they belong, it is a completely better. And even if these kind of the separatists who are actually seeking the truth, who are actually seeking the truth and counter to the governmental narrative, we can recognize them as a separatist, them as a betrayer of the company, and more unification based on the hands of the majority citizens can be achieved. We say this is more better than the conflict in their paradigm, actually attacking each other based on the truth. That's why we are happy to support the nationalism, as happy to support the state-created narrative at the first place. My substantive will be based on the comparison, and first I want to talk about why in their paradigm this kind of the truth or the kind of truth of the history can be facilitated by the agitators and why the consequences is bad. And secondly, I want to talk about why the unification based on the facilitation of the history can be achieved by countering the separatists. Why this is rather good than their reality. Before moving on to my argument, some rebuttal to kick out the OO to the debate. They are actually opposing the nationalism itself because the nationalism is an artificial concept, unlike the religion or other kind of the thing. And secondly, the nationalism is actually creating the harm, like in the Hungary, the denial of the refugees and so forth, Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen. But, Mr. Speaker, what we should recognize, what's the priority in this debate? The country in the Yugoslavia or other kind of devastated country in now, what we need in the first is to unite the citizens at the first place. Because as long as citizens cannot be united, they cannot believe the religion, they cannot assure their secure life at the first place. Religion or other kind of value can come the second, but it is not first. That's why we need a nationalism to unification at the first. This is the top priority we have to pursue in this debate. Firstly, moving on to the first paradigm, why in their paradigm is actually the truth is facilitated in the bad way. This is a completely simple logic because the truth is very heavy, the truth is very devastating because they have to teach massacre, ethnic cleansing, or the killing or genocide, other kind of the heinous act can be revealed in the history. What kind How they facilitate this kind of narrative? First, two analyses I have. Firstly, this kind of the narrative is actually personalized. My grandfather or my grand-grandfather is actually killed by your ethnicities, and this kind of personalized narrative is created, and hatred is accumulating. And secondly, the politician has a huge incentive to agitate this kind of rhetoric based on the truth. Because we are actually one ethnicity different from you to support to gather the voting or to actually oppress the other kind of ethnicity. This is a reality, unfortunately, based on the truth. What is happening in the status quo? We think this is not good because they cannot unify at the end of the day based on the truth. Rather we say, second substantive, based on a unification based on falsification is rather good. Why is that? It's simple logic. Before moving on to my second point, I will happy to take opening.
So you said the truth is too heavy and people will not be happy to accept it, but why was it not a problem in Germany and why was it not a problem in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which now is a peaceful country after all the ethnic cleansing?
Okay, Germany's Holocaust example is completely out of debate because this is not relevant with the ethnic history or something like that. This is completely international thing. This is out of debate. Why unification based on the facilitation can be achieved? Simply, we believe nationalism, because the nationalism brings up the tolerance or cooperation among the citizens. We, as a one nation state, we can tolerate other kinds of people. We can actually make an active contribution among the society. This kind of unification under the nationalism is fundamentally the first step to establish the nation in the state. That's why this is what we pursue in this scenario. And why we can do this? Because the simply motion tells. Firstly, we are happy to educate the children from the beginning to tell a state narrative and to state fallible narrative. We are actually friends, we are actually not enemy. And secondly, we use the media outlets to actually censor the content of the speech or the content of the outlet. And we are actually unite, and the majority people can actually still believe this kind of narrative. This kind of the narrative is uniquely provided in the nation state. And the majority of citizens actually try to unify them, try to believe in the narrative, and try to be friendly with each other, Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, because they are actually educated in such way, they are actually informed in such kind of the way. Recognizing this situation, what is the important point here is even if this kind of the intelligent separatist is coming up and try to reveal the truth or try to reveal the true history, we are actually enemy, or we actually do the massacre. Or the majority people do not want to believe this, actually try to counter this kind of minority people, because we are unified now. We do not want additional conflict caused by the new separatists or new intelligent people who are actually trying to reveal this kind of truth, Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen. Truth or this kind of good value is not important in this debate, because we have to stand up for the more materialistic value, for more materialistic unification we are supporting. In this paradigm, we can support the majority citizens' view, and more unification can be achieved. Because this kind of minority regarded as a common enemy for us, they are trying to separate our nation that have been actually unified in state narrative. Actually, we can more and more unified because we are actually find the enemy of our common enemy we have in the state after taking proposal. That's why even if this kind of the truth fighting is happening, or they are actually seeking to hold their say, we are actually happy to unite, and at the end of the day we can support the paradigm. Actually, unification is more likely to happen than their paradigm. For this reason, we are very proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the previous speaker and call upon the member of the opposition to defend the opposition time.
The one logical link missing throughout side government is on how necessarily this falsification builds unity. They never really told us on how oppressed groups will suddenly forget everything, will forget all the years of oppression, will forget the oppression that they blame their current state on, will forget the kind of oppression that made them feel that, okay, we are poor today because our ancestors have always been oppressed. We don't think that is the case. We don't think that this kind builds any kind of sustainable national unity, and that is our stance from opposition. So we'll talk to you about two things today. The first thing we'll talk to you about is on how the next step forward is reparations and mending bridges, and that is the best way to build your national identity. And the second thing we'll talk to you about on how our world will have a better form of national identity with more free speech and lesser oppression. But first, one point of rebuttal. They spoke to us about national identity, and I've already told you on how the oppressed will not forget. But also we believe we've seen a lot of communities that have been disadvantaged and oppressed on how their struggle defines their culture. In fact, they feel more oppressed when the state goes out to actively put down their culture, to actively stop them from talking about their lived experiences and the lived experiences of their grandfathers, the tales within their cultures and the tales that they talk about, and the stories and the songs and whatnot. We believe that these are the instances where the oppressed group finds it difficult to assimilate with this national identity, because of which you'll only have this fractured identity. But also they spoke about instances of ethnic violence and how suddenly this could like bring a stop halt to never-ending violence, without necessarily contending with the fact that ethnic violence still goes on today. People today would still feel that my uncle or my grandfather was killed by this person, and people still feel the pain. Because of which they never really spoke to us about how deleting history or not talking about it in schools or not talking about it in the newspaper or the internet necessarily clamps down on these discussions that may happen behind closed doors at homes, clamps down on these discussions that may happen amongst people, and we believe that those kinds of discussions are discussions that fester dissent, those kinds of discussions are discussions that fester dissatisfaction and hence do not lead to the kind of unity that they speak of. So the first thing on reparation and mending bridges. We believe that falsifying history is a very convenient line for states to hold. It's a very convenient line for states to hold after a lot of oppression. And we believe that the best way to bolster identity is by giving reparations. OG didn't tell us on how forgetting builds national identity, but we believe in a post-conflict society, the best way going ahead is to acknowledge past crimes. Because the first thing is that the oppressed group can then feel some sense of closure. That oppressed group may then get the necessary reparation to bring them out of the oppression. And we believe that this will also resonate with the larger groups and help them build towards a larger identity, because they will also feel that if in the future they were to be oppressed, the state will stand by them. But why do we need reparations? We believe that we argue from closing opposition that disadvantaged groups that have been historically disadvantaged are still disadvantaged today because of those past oppression. And we believe because of that we need reparations, and necessarily deleting history and not talking about history and censoring that history is antithetical to providing reparations. Because in order to provide reparations, you need to talk about the past wrongs you've done. You need to talk about how you're apologetic for it, and you need to talk about how you're going to go ahead and solve it. But how do past wrongs necessarily affect people today? So we'll talk to you about that, because history matters. We believe that historically a lot of communities have been systematically oppressed, as a result of which those communities are still disadvantaged. We've seen that amongst the black communities in America, where they were denied access to college, they were denied access to voting, and they were ghettoized they were ghettoized, because of which, and they were also denied passing down of wealth, because of which white people have always been privileged, because of which black people have always been systematically oppressed. We've also seen that in India, where certain individuals were locked into caste systems. They were locked into certain professions, as a result of which their descendants today are also disadvantaged. We believe for those communities, the best thing moving forward is to acknowledge the past wrongdoings and to do your best to improve their conditions. The best way to do so is to probably bring ahead representation for those communities, to provide them quotas in universities, or provide them quotas for jobs. But the second thing is that if you neglect this context about those communities, there leads to a lot of discrimination against those communities. Think about black communities in America. When you neglect the context that the struggle that black communities face, the kind of discrimination and the kind of stereotyping against those communities in America increases to a much greater degree. And we believe that this festers a very fractured idea of a national identity and not a national identity that we would want to stand for. I'll take opening.
Is including minority groups in the independence narratives, for example, like controversial? How is the story of a black patriot, for example, divisive? And if so, like how can including these people actually not help create a national project in which everyone is included?
Well, I guess like from your first speech, your stance was that we'll not talk about conflicts, we'll not talk about genocides, and I believe that like that is what you want to defend. Through your POI, it seems like you're backtracking on your stance, and we believe that like that is something that is something you don't stand for. But on our second idea on freedom of speech, we believe in order to delete history, there are a lot of steps you need to go ahead and do. You need to censor the internet and media. You need to police social media to look for any instances of this past history and go ahead and delete this. And states often in those instances are very cautious about getting caught. Think about China after Tiananmen Square. We believe that that kind of leads to an air or an environment where people are afraid to talk about their oppression, where people are afraid to talk about their lived experiences and their experiences even today. And we see that as that has a choking effect on free speech today. We believe that that does not foster the right kind of national identity. But why is this particularly bad? Because this is bad because their identity is based on some short-term national identity based on compliance and following rules. We believe in a world where people can talk about the oppression and their lived experiences that they even face today is a world that's more desirable, because that's a world where people can get out of their oppression by talking about it. Now we believe that like this choking effect on free speech about historical events, deleting history or falsifying history, necessarily leads to choking of free speech about events today. Because oppression or events today that may harm national unity and national identity will then be deleted, going by side propositions, ideas, because of which people will always be scared to talk about their experiences, because of which we see that as harmful. So we come and spoken to you about two things. We've spoken to you about how the state needs to acknowledge wrongdoings and try to mend bridges, and we've also spoken to you about how this has a choking effect on free speech, and people need to talk about their struggles and oppression. We're very proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the previous speaker and call upon the government witness on the government side.
Mr. Speaker, previous speaker said, oppressed people don't forget to oppress. Oppressed people don't forget to be oppressed. Yes, I concede that, but in our side of the house, we can defame these kind of people as separatists. These people constantly say, I am discriminated, so that's why I have to counter back these oppressing people. This kind of narrative does exist under both paradigms, but in our side of the house, majority people believe we as the national citizen, we have to unify it. This separatist is an enemy. In order to protect our nation, we have to defend them. This narrative is fundamentally important in this debate. Why is that so? Opening government explained why unification is important, but unfortunately he forgot to explain how. My partners explained how this unification does happen in our side of the house. We can actually defend the separatists as a separatist. Can unify this society to get the peaceful society. This is a clear extension coming from my partner. I want to deal with no thank you. Two issues in my speech. Firstly, let's look at what kind of history which we support. I want to clarify this point. Secondly, let's examine how should we deal with these separatists. Under both paradigms, separatists does exist. How should we deal with them? So, but before that, I want to engage what previous speaker had said. Previous speaker said, so we need reparation, we need compensation to disadvantaged group like black people and so forth in the United States. First and foremost, Mr. Speaker, in our side of the house, without history, we can save this disadvantaged group. What do I mean by that? Because without history, in the status quo, we can see clear difference, clear income gap between white and black. The black people, statistically, black people committed more crime than white. Then white group has a massive incentive to give more education, to give more scholarship to the black people, to give more affirmative action for black people in order to tackle on this difference between the white and the black. Even in our side of the house, the majority people has an incentive to do so. There is no necessity to teach the history. Black people was the slavery. That's why we have to save the black people. This narrative does not necessarily to save them first and foremost. Even in the status quo, reality that shows you there's a necessity to tackle on this program. I cannot see any necessity to tell the history is potentially to separate this country and lead the conflict within the society. Yes.
Which community would want to be part of a nation which first goes ahead and oppresses communities and then defames them every time they want to talk about their oppression and defames them every time they want to liberate themselves?
So that's a nice point. Under our side of the house, we can actually teach this false information. We can tell a lie that the vast majority people believe actually get benefit from this form of the society. The people actually enjoy with this peaceful society. I can unify as a nation. I can actually get identity as this country. People has incentive to protect this common good. These people has incentive to protect the property. That's why people actually has a massive incentive to seek this kind of peace. This is my extension. So move back the point. So as I said before, there's no necessity to tell a history to actually tackle on this to give the reparation at first and the foremost. Also, previous speaker said, why in our side of the house, white guy actually hesitate to talk about the slavery and so forth. It's kind of oppress the freedom of speech. But we actually support the freedom of expression. We support the free speech. In our side of the house, we actually support the idea. But if these kind of people constantly say, the black people constantly say, we are discriminated by white. That's why we have to counter back to white, like Malcolm X. Malcolm X is actually the kind of the separatists. They actually the spotlight difference between white and black, and actually he encouraged this kind of the conflict within the white and black. There is no necessity to talking about this history of the slavery. So without doing so, we can tackle on this program by more affirmative action, by more the scholarship, by more support to black people. So because white people already recognize there is a program in the society. Without telling the history, we can tackle on this program. Telling history empower Malcolm X to separate this country to lead the more conflict. We oppose that narrative. So, having said that, moving on first point, what kind history which we support? Government side seems to assume this information must be biased. But as long as we are talking about in order to actually strengthen, in order to create national identity to get peace, there's no incentive to make biased history. If you are happy to respect every kind of religion, every kind of ethnicity, we can tell a lie. The Muslim, Christianity, the Orthodox people live peacefully, they lived harmoniously as nation citizens. We actually tell this. We are happy to tell this kind of lie in our side of the house. There's no necessity to be biased because this is the important point. If this history was biased, at the end of the day, some ethnicity, some religious people have to get disadvantage. It actually leads to more separation, it leads to more unstable society. That's why in this way, as long as we are talking about, we take this motion in order to create peace, in order to get stable society. There's no incentive, there's no necessity to provide biased information. Even if we start to tell a lie, there's no necessity to provide biased history. That's why we support non-biased history first and foremost. So moving on to second point, which side of the how should we deal with separatists, which is obstacle to get the peace? In their side of the house, because government constantly tell a truth. That's why they actually empower these kind of separatists to say, I am a truth, I was oppressed. That's why we are disadvantaged group. That's why we are poor. We have to fight against this majority people. The politicians agitate this kind of incentive, and the system itself react what the politician just say. Hatred, the anger toward the majority, anger toward past oppressing people doesn't exist in their side of the house, but we can deal with this guy as a separatist, as a common enemy of the state. That's why we can actually deal with this guy in better way, we propose.
I'd like to thank the previous speaker and call upon the opposition whip to conclude his
Mr. Speaker, having been the only team in the House that has explained to you why we think history uniquely gives us the ability to correct past wrongs and to, in the long term, sustainably remove the kind of ethnic tensions that plague post-conflict societies, is the reason why we win this debate from closing opposition, right? We tell you that let's first talk about the government bench and what they've tried to do in this debate, right? The first question, in terms of what is this kind of history that is likely to be falsified? We think that opening government has been dilly-dallying on their stance in terms of what they're going to falsify and what they're not, right? We see realistic characterization coming out in closing government in terms of the kind of things that are likely to be clamped down on states. What are we talking about, right? 4 things. Firstly, we think instances such as removing records of state-sponsored genocide, the way we've seen in India and Gujarat in 2003, or in Rwanda against the Hutus, right? But secondly, we talk about clamping down on uprisings against the government. For example, the Tiananmen Square uprising, which was clamped down by the Chinese government. And thirdly, on systematic oppression of a community. For example, blacks in America. They can't say that we're not going to defend that because, well, America didn't choose that path. In their world, we think America would just get up and say, oh no, black and white people have always been friends, and hence we don't need to do anything to correct this, right? That's a world that we don't want to live in, right? But moreover, and closing government tells us this explicitly, right? They say that people who are dissenting against the government, against the state, are going to be branded as separatists and traitors and shunned to the corners of society, right? We think it's abhorrent that they choose to defend that stance in this debate, right? Because not only are you oppressing these people for years and years, but at the point at which they choose to voice their struggles and choose to try and break out of them, you brand them as separatists and push them further into the shadows, right? We think it's completely abhorrent that that's the stance that closing government decided to take, right? But okay, even if this kind of falsification, which we think has large harms in terms of oppressing people and not correcting this in the future, is something that is a virtue in this debate if it allows you to bring about national identity, none of these two teams have ever explained to us why is this idea of national unity so important, right? Like, at no point in their 4 speeches have we heard any piece of analysis which explains this question, right? We tell you countries can do perfectly fine without an overarching idea of national unity, right? Just look at India, for example. You have regional identities that are stronger than national identities, but it's still a functioning state because, well, you have a robust democracy where separate interests can be contended with in a constructive fashion, right? At no point have they told us why we're willing to sacrifice things such as free speech and things such as building a more inclusive national identity, for whatever monolithic national unity that they're trying to defend, right? But even if you accept that, what is the kind of national unity that they are going to bring about in their world, right? They say that, oh, it's going to be multicultural, without giving us a single explanation or a single example of why this is likely or where this has happened, right? We think it's more likely to be a majoritarian idea of national identity, the way we see in China, which is dominated by the political elite, right? Which means that at the point at which anyone tries to come and speak out, sit down against the government, we say that these voices are clamped down, right? So we don't think that you can just come out here and assert multiculturalism. We say that what's likely to happen is that states, this sets a very, very bad precedent for states in terms of erasing their history, right? Why? We think that it's important for states or governments to remain popular so that they can continue to remain in power, right? And continue to have high approval ratings. Which means that anything that affects or tarnishes the reputation or the image of the government is likely to be just taken out of the history books and like taken away from the common knowledge in their world, right? We think that this sets a bad precedent in terms of governments now making convenient choices and not taking the hard decision to contend with like the difficult parts of their past, right? So they say that sure, like, we won't remove it if it helps in creating national identity, right? I mean, give you the example of Germany. Germany could have very easily just denied Holocaust and moved on, right? They decided to sit down, they decided to make the difficult choice of accepting the horrific parts of their past, of owning the fact that they did really, really bad things, which helps shape their future actions in terms of not doing it again, right? We think that's the kind of reconciliation and understanding that both gov benches lose out in their world, right? But before I talk to you about why we think that like history gives us a unique ability to correct these past wrongs, I'll take up here from closing.
Without past history, people want to solve problems which lead to potentially conflict. People already have that incentive to tackle on this kind of problem.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
History is necessary.
Let's talk about that. Understand this. In your world, you undermine the work of truth and reconciliation efforts in post-conflict societies, right? Because even if your state comes out and tells you that you have been friends all along and there has never been any ethnic tensions, that tension is not going to go away, right? If you are a Sunni man in Syria, you know that your father was killed by the Shia army, right? We tell you that understanding is never going to go away, which means at the point in time in which a small amount of violence or anything erupts, we think that the kind of mistrust or suspicion that exists and continues to exist in their world because they've just clamped down on it and refused to like contend with it is when we think it's going to boil over every time sit down there's a small spark or a small amount of violence that happens, right? Moreover, we say that the comparative that we offer to you is where people come out and talk about their past wrongs, own to their past deeds, and we think that's the only way in which you can reconcile the tensions between two communities, not by just painting a brush over it, right? But moreover, on the idea of reparations, right? We say that given the fact that history is important in understanding ideas of privilege and the fact that lack of privilege is often inherited, we think that's a major reason why certain communities deserve reparations more than others. So in closing government, you can't come out and tell us that, oh, just give it to poor people. Well, that's called progressive taxation and that already happens. But clearly it's not enough because, well, some communities deserve more than just that by virtue of being oppressed for hundreds and hundreds of years, right? That's the kind of understanding that opening government completely lacked when in the first speech they say, oh, well, history doesn't matter because, well, somebody who died 100 years ago, what do we care about them, right? We think that the kind of experiences that your ancestors face are in fact inherited to you through things such as wealth transfer and the other sorts of lack of privilege, right? But finally, we tell you that only in our world can you have a constructive rebuilding effort, right? Because the existence of the kind of things that they're likely to clamp down upon, for example, uprisings against the government or like the existence of armed rebel groups in these countries, points towards a larger problem. It points towards the systematic oppression of these communities, and the only way you can solve this in the long run is to accept it and try to work towards rebuilding those communities and not brush them under the carpet. Never been more proud to oppose.